Hey everybody, want to wish you Gemar Chatima Tova, a very excellent, good and final sealing. Um, I want to welcome you on behalf of the Sanctuary at the Pico Union Project. We really hope that this year's virtual services found a way to touch your heart and make a powerful difference in the start of this new year. My name is Stuart K Robinson. I've had the pleasure of being a creative partner to Craig Taubman since the inception of the Pico Union Project and years before that. Our principle at the Pico Union, our founding principle, is to love your neighbor as you wish to be loved. And we've tried to do that by using the arts and our hearts through things like services and food markets and classes and seminars and concerts and speaking events and planting hundreds of trees and plants in the neighborhood and more. This year, everybody's saying it's really the most important time to vote. Well, you know, obviously, it's always the most important time to take advantage of your right to be a part of shaping the future of our country. But this year, especially, might be a very interesting time. And I want to say, for me personally, I always feel guilty at the ballot booth, because a lot of times I know I'm voting about stuff that I have no idea what it means. Especially like when I'm voting for judges. I don't know any of these people. I don't know their background. And I'm kind of listening for the name that sounds the most fair and judicious. And I don't think that's a way to vote. So this year, we have 12 propositions on the ballot. These are measures that will make a difference in our future and what the state spends and what kinds of justice issues are taken care of. So we thought it would be a great idea to bring on some experts in the political process and really get some insight on these 12 propositions so that when you go to the polls, you really know what you're talking about and you can make an informed decision about what you're doing. So we said, who should we get? Well, there was very little choice. We knew we wanted the director of the Thomas and Dorothy Levy Center for the Study of Los Angeles. He's a graduate of University of Michigan, and we'll forgive him, also of USC, UCLA household. What can I tell you? But his scholarly work is in areas like local governance and urban politics and racial and ethnic politics. So a perfect person to talk to us, and we'll get to know him more and more about him as we talk to him. But I really want to welcome and say what an honor it is to have Dr. Fernando J Guerra here. Hi.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. And by the way, my wife, Lolly Daslan, is a graduate of UCLA, so we are a mixed household.
I'm unplugging my headset because it keeps popping in and out. I hope you can still hear me very well.
Nice and loud.
Most people didn't even know there is a study of Los Angeles going on. Can you just say a few words about how you got into that work and what drew you to it? And
Sure. From the beginning, I've always been interested in urban politics and how LA has unfolded. And that's what I wrote my dissertation on. That's what I was hired at LMU to do, to teach state and local politics. The 1992 disturbances happened, and they happened in late April. Our seniors were about to graduate and basically saying, you're throwing us out into this world and you haven't trained us, you haven't talked to us, you haven't discussed LA. Most of us are from LA, most of us are going to stay in LA. And at that point, you know, I approached the university and said, we should have a center for the study of Los Angeles. It is very Jesuit to name universities after their cities. There are 28 Jesuit universities in America. Some of them are the University of Seattle, you know, University of St. Louis. You can go on and on. Even Georgetown, the original one, it really was named after Georgetown. There was no DC at that time. Right. So city, university, city, Jesuit makes sense. And so that's why we began the Center for the Study of Los Angeles.
That's beautiful. And thank you for the work that you do. Appreciate it. We're going to dig into these propositions, but I want to introduce your partner in crime today. It made sense to get a professor of Loyola Law School who studies the law of the political process, which includes election law and governance issues, et cetera. And particularly, our next guest focuses on ethics and political corruption, voting rights, campaign finance, ballot initiatives, redistricting, term limits, and state budgets. So my goodness, do we need her now? Please welcome Jessica Levinson. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Glad to have you. So when you're not, I know a lot of our viewers hear you on KCRW on the show Passing Judgment every week, and you're always on different TV shows and things like that, giving legal advice. What do you do for fun when you're not being so legal and officious?
I do this with Fernando. This is my downtime. No, but this is, I mean, I was honored to ask, and I'm always very happy if Fernando asks me to do something with him. So this is, in fact, my treat for the day.
That's great.
Yeah, so Jessica is a graduate of Loyola Marymount University and was a political science major. So she still feels compelled to say yes when anybody from the faculty calls her. In addition, obviously, we're talking about Pico Union Project, and we have 2 Jesuit missions in Pico Union, Loyola High School, but also the law school. So Jessica is actually a Pico Union homegirl stakeholder, given that she spends her time there in Pico Union at the law school.
I appreciate it. And as a board member of the Pico Union, I thank you, Jessica. Let's jump into these propositions because there are 12 of them on the ballot this year. And me being in the entertainment industry, what I've done is give them each sort of Academy Award titles, and I'll set it up and let you guys kind of talk about it. So the first one is Proposition 14, which I've labeled most controversial for reasons that people don't really understand why there's controversy. And Prop 14 is the Stem Cell Research Initiative Institute Bond Initiative, and it would issue $5.5 billion in general obligation bonds. Maybe we'll talk about what those are, for the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine, which was created to fund stem cell research. A lot of people, you hear stem cell and you start to immediately get nervous. So what can you tell us about Prop 14 and what to look for?
I'll let Jessica go first. You okay with that, Jessica?
Sure. So as you said, this is and I'm sorry for the bad Zoom etiquette. I'm going to look at my notes a little bit because there are 12. So as you said, this would mean that we would borrow $5.5 billion to fund stem cell research. If this sounds a little bit familiar, it's because back in 2004, we actually passed a proposition to create the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine, as you said, and that institute channels state money towards stem cell research. The proposition that we passed back in 2004 actually let the state borrow, I think, just over $3 billion, but there's no more money in that bucket right now. So there's a wealthy Silicon Valley real estate developer, Robert Klein, who led the effort for that 2004 ballot measure and is now leading the effort to campaign for more money, again, to the tune of $5.5 billion. One thing about bonds that I would just mention, people tend to think, oh, it doesn't raise taxes because it's free money. I would say, and this isn't an argument against the measure, but of course, a bond, a general obligation, it does have to be paid back and with interest. So it's just something to consider that it's not free money. At some point, we will have to pay, we will have to repay our debt.
And it's usually over 30 years, so you could almost double. So the taxpayers will end up borrowing $5.5 billion, but probably paying back something around 10 to 11 billion, just like you do in your mortgage. You know, you take a look and you borrow, you know, $400,000 or $500,000 to buy a house, and you end up paying $1 million over the 30 years. The best argument for this is, of course, stem cell research has the potential to solve all kinds of dramatic illnesses that human beings, not just Californians or Americans, have. And so sure, we should be investing in this to the greatest degree possible. The arguments against it is we invested $3 billion, so what do we have to show for it? Second is, this is very unusual for state level to do this. Typically, this type of research is funded by universities, foundations, and the federal government. It's really mission creep to some extent that states are involved in this. They're not necessarily the best ones to do it, et cetera. And so those are the arguments against it. But obviously back in 2004, the state decided to step into it because they felt not enough was being done and they wanted to be a catalyst for it, and they want to continue to be a catalyst for it. So this is a tough. Jessica, how are you going to vote on this?
Are we really doing that?
Yeah, why not?
Or let me put it this way, I don't think I'm doing that.
Okay, so.
All right, let me ask a couple questions. I
Sure.
gather that of the 3 billion they got in 2004, there's something like 132 million remaining, and now they need another 5 billion. But I think the reason people are controversial about stem cells is they don't know that there are many types of stem cell researches, and some of it is fetal stem cell. So everybody's worried about that. But there are also adult versions, et cetera. And the studies they're doing are seeking to bring about cures and help with things like heart disease and stroke and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and diabetes and things like that. So it is very important research. I guess the question is it worth the you're going to say 5 to 10 billion by the time all is done to conduct research?
I think most of the newspapers who have looked at this have endorsed it. Prop 14 tends to be a very popular one for the reasons that you talked about. Name cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes, Parkinson's, kidney disease. All of these are diseases. As Fernando said, these aren't things that just affect Californians. They affect people throughout the globe. And so these tend to be very popular. People see, I know stem cell does scare certain people, but it doesn't mean fetal tissue. People tend to see, research for medical diseases, and those are pretty popular. Now, I think the real question in this particular election is, will we be in a spending frame of mind, given that we may be going into another either recession or depression? I think that could affect a number of the ballot measures in terms of how much are we willing to spend or be taxed right now.
Yeah. So I think I'm going to vote for this. I had some hesitation. Is one of the tougher ones for me. 5.5 billion is a lot of money. It'll be like 10 billion when you pay the interest. But when you take a look at it, compared to the size of the budget, is minimal. And you don't compare it to the budget of just this year, 200 million. You compare it to the budget over the next 30 years, which if you extrapolate the way the budget's been growing, et cetera, we're talking about $4 trillion that the state of California will spend over the next 30 years. Out of that 4 trillion, asking for 10 billion, it's less than 0.1%. Is it worth it given the potential for success? I think it is. It may end up really making a tremendous difference in the lives of many people. And that's why I think it's worth taking a chance.
That's great. And I'm going to play this game with you, Dr. Guerra. I'll be your other half. I too would vote for this. When I think of the lives that it could save, and I have a friend who's been in a wheelchair for life and has been told many times that stem cell breakthroughs would give him the ability to walk again. I think it's worth it. So that's my choice there. All right, let's go to Prop 15, which I've labeled the most difficult to understand unless you're a real estate investor. Prop 15 is the tax on commercial and industrial properties for education and local government funding. So if you vote yes on this, this is a constitutional amendment that is going to require commercial and industrial properties, except those zoned in commercial agriculture areas, to be taxed based on their market value rather than their purchase price. So if you have an industrial property that you're going to sell, that you own, your taxes on it would move from the price you bought it for to the market value. That's all I know. Maybe you guys can make sense of this.
Do you want me to go first again?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, we can switch off. It depends on whatever you like. There's plenty to say on this one. Go ahead.
All right. I'll lay the groundwork for you to do the smart stuff. So Prop 15 is the so-called split roll, and Prop 15 basically changes what might be California's most famous ballot initiative, which is Prop 13, passed back in 1978. So what did we do in 1978? We basically froze property taxes, and we said that property taxes are not going to increase more than 1% every year, and all property taxes, so for commercial and residential properties. This really ushered in kind of an anti-tax wave, not just in California, but in other parts of the nation. Yep. And what it did is it just really decreased funding for local governments and particularly for schools. And that's why you see schools being so reliant on the state for funding. And people have said that it just led to this precipitous drop in particularly per pupil funding.
Right.
Now, Prop 13 is often regarded as like the third rail in California. You can't touch it. This is another attempt at touching it, but not hitting the part that most Californians are kind of most worried about, which is the residential property. I think it's really hard to make a case for voters, many of whom either own homes or think at some point they will own homes, to repeal the protections for residential property owners. So what this would do is it basically just pulls back that part of Prop 15 that deals with commercial properties that are big enough to hit that $3 million mark. And it says that you will be taxed not on the purchase price only increasing 1% per year, but as you said, on the fair market value. This will bring in billions of dollars literally for funding for schools. And I think, again, one of the big questions is during a pandemic, when it looks like the economic outlook in California is not that great, will typically liberal voters say, this is not the time for a tax increase, because I'm worried that those commercial real estate landlords will push the, their higher costs will push the taxes down to their tenants? Or is this the time more than ever to invest in education? I tend to think that might be the argument here. It's polling as of last week at 51%, which is not that high. It's easier to move people to no than it is to yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Guerra, what do you think?
By far the most significant proposition on the ballot. And it will probably, more money will be spent on it probably than any other proposition, with the possible exception of 22. But those two, I think, are going to vie for which are going to be the most expensive. I can't help but do my professor thing here and make the following two very, very broad comments. California had an incredible consensus and understanding from the 50s through the 60s, both Democrats and Republicans, that we were going to invest in California. During that time, we invested in the UCs, the water system, the highways, K through 12 education. We were the leaders in all of these areas, not only in the United States, but in the world. And that consensus, that contract basically ended in 1978. And Proposition 13, which is the most important political act in the history of California, that said, we no longer believe in our future. We are happy where we are, and we want to preserve what we have and not invest anymore. And that's what Proposition 13 did. From 1978 to 2003, the recall of Governor Gray Davis, it was a Republican conservative regime that passed all kinds of statewide legislation. That regime lasted that long, and there are at least 20 significant ballot measures that they passed statewide because they couldn't control the legislature in terms of districts. And since then, there's been now a very progressive Democratic regime that has systematically tried to undo that. And we've seen it in terms of not only this proposition, but also the next one, Proposition 16, which repeals a proposition from that era. And that is what's happening here, saying that we don't want to be part of that regime anymore. We're progressives. We believe in the future. We have to start reinvesting, and this is one of those steps. That's a very broad picture that then dovetails to what Jessica was talking about, the more short-term what is happening. This was one that I feel strongly about. There are some problems. I do believe that the additional taxes will filter down and impact renters, etc. But there is much, much more good than bad in this proposition. And so very supportive of it.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of education, and also I'm an optimist. So I believe that we're going to come out of this pandemic and this economic crisis well. So I'm going to roll the dice on yes, let's raise some money for schools.
Yep.
Okay, the next is Proposition 16, which I've labeled the proposition people will most likely vote incorrectly on because the language is so confusing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Prop 16 asks to repeal Proposition 209, the affirmative action amendment. And I'll tell you my confusion at first. It sounds like if you vote yes on this, you're going to repeal affirmative action.
Correct.
But actually, what it appears to be is that you're voting to repeal Prop 209, which ruled affirmative action, let's call it unconstitutional for lack of a better word. So before we finish, and I want everybody at home, be taking notes, because this is really confusing when you get in that ballot booth and you're going, yes to repeal. Let's make sure we understand it before we vote on it. Dr. Guerra, you want to kick this one off?
Sure. I have no qualms about being quote unquote political in terms of these propositions. And I could just tell you that the fact, and you see this playing out right now at the national level, where Republicans know something is correct and they use that language. And so you will hear them talk about, yes, Black lives do matter, you know, yes, women's rights do matter, et cetera. But even though we're going to take action that's completely opposite of that, but they give lip service to it because they know that how can you be against something that totally makes sense? And you see the same thing when this proposition was first put together in 1994 or 96, excuse me. And their whole language was vote for this to have equal rights, to not have preferential treatment, etc. They used all the language of civil rights and affirmative action to pass this, and basically miscommunicating on purpose. And you see this again today. Now, it did not poll very well in the initial polls, and that is because you are absolutely right, Stuart. People are confused. I do believe this proposition will end up passing as more people understand it, and as they get validators telling them that they're in support. So Governor Newsom has endorsed it. The mayor, I mean, you'll see the whole Democratic regime, all the liberal progressives in a state that Biden's going to win by 30 points. Every single person who's supporting Biden, et cetera, is going to be endorsing this. And they will have all the money because there are very few people, moneyed people, who are going to be against it. So they'll be able to control the airwaves. What it does not lead to affirmative action. It just removes the prohibition against affirmative action, and then it will allow local governments, school districts, other governmental entities, if they want to, if they develop within the rules of the Supreme Court and other laws guiding affirmative action, if they want to put a program together. That's what this does.
That's great. Jessica, got anything to add to that?
I have very little to add. It's interesting because Dr. Guerra is the expert on this. I think what you emphasize is exactly right, which is it ends the ban. And it reminds me of back in, I think it was 2008 with Prop 8, where voting yes would create a situation where marriage was only defined between a man and a woman, but people thought they were voting yes in favor of gay marriage. The racial dynamics are interesting in the sense that we see again that it's typically members of the Asian American community who are against this measure and say that it would harm them. And then members of the Black, African American, and Latinx communities who are in favor of the measure. And one thing to notice is that in 1996, after that measure passed, there really was a precipitous drop in Black and Latinx enrollment in UCs. And that's one of the things that people need to consider when they're looking at this, is that, again, precipitous drop in minorities that are otherwise underrepresented in higher education.
Right. So folks at home, just a reminder, if you vote yes on this, you're not voting to repeal affirmative action. You're voting to repeal the ban on affirmative action and just empower government officials to make those kinds of decisions, to kind of level the playing field in terms of the number of women and people of color and et cetera who are being hired. So that's Prop 16. Let's move forward. Prop 17, I labeled the one that probably has, I think, the most hidden ideas in, so you're worried that you're voting for something that you're not sure you want to vote for. and that is the Voting Rights Restoration for Persons on Parole amendment. Again, a constitutional amendment that allows people who have served a sentence and have been paroled to now vote, where at present parolees are not allowed to vote. So
I'll let the lawyer go first.
I just looked behind me. I got scared when you said the lawyer. So this is part of a nationwide discussion that we're having about felon voting rights and the voting rights of people who have already served their time. And what this ballot measure would do is just say to people who have been convicted of certain felonies, you can begin to vote even when you're on parole. You don't have to wait until you're off parole in order to get your voting rights back. Now, there are a lot of states considering variations of this. We know that these laws disproportionately affect Black and Latinx communities. I think there are about 40,000 Californians who are not in prison, but can't cast ballots because they're still on parole. And this would affect that group of at least 40,000. Now, of course, the politics behind it is that the people who are on parole, who would have their voting rights restored, are more likely, we know, to vote for Democratic candidates. And so Democrats tend to be in favor of this. Republicans in general tend to be in favor of more restrictive voting measures. And so it's kind of a microcosm of what we see play out more generally throughout the nation, where we see Democrats pushing for ways for more people to vote, make it easier to vote, Republicans saying, we need to make sure that there is not voter fraud, or in this case, that people serve their full terms. And that's really the argument. The argument in favor is, if you have been in prison, if you have if you're now on parole, you should be allowed to be a member of society and take part in the shape of your society. The argument against it is really, you have not served your full term yet if you're on parole. We will wait until you complete your parole and we'll see if you do it successfully, and then you can have your voting rights restored.
Okay. Dr. Guerra, thoughts?
Yes, totally in favor of this. I'm voting yes. I think it's the criminal justice reforms that are going throughout the nation. This is part of it. There is nothing in the U.S. Constitution that prohibits someone on parole, a felon, or even someone in prison from voting. This is a state law. There are 2 states in America that you can actually be in prison and vote. And so why? Because people believe that your voting is not a privilege. Voting is a right, and you have that right even if you're in prison, even in your parole, you have that. So it's symbolic in a sense. And this, from the state perspective, truly is symbolic. Professor Levinson mentioned that it would impact 40,000 people. There are 21 million registered voters in California. 40,000 is a drop on that. And given that, we have a low percentage of registration and turnout, you would even say that the likelihood of these 40,000 registering and actually voting in the next couple of years is like at the most 25,000. 25,000 out of 21 million will make absolutely no difference statewide for sure. Absolutely no difference in any congressional race. It has no practical impact on elections other than the actual individual voting and symbolically. So for us to be an inclusive state that doesn't over-punish, I would vote yes on this, absolutely.
And it won't seriously impact the election, but it might seriously impact the way in which
Correct.
that individual feels.
Correct.
They're welcome.
And who we are as Californians, absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to remind the folks who are watching that we're not trying to push one political party over another or one agenda. We're just telling you how we see it.
Yeah.
And hopefully giving you enough information to understand the
So,
issue.
Stuart, I'm going to disagree with you a little bit. I have no qualms pushing my agenda and giving you my opinion of where I'm going to vote and why I'm going to vote and justifying it. And I feel very much an activist, and I'm telling you, yes, you should vote yes on Proposition 16, 15. So I feel very strongly about both of those, 15, 16, and 17. Absolutely.
Right. Let's keep going. Prop 18, I called the proposition most likely to be defeated if you don't read the fine print. So here's why I say that. Prop 18 is primary voting for 17-year-olds amendment. And basically what this does is if there's a what do you call that? A general election coming up,
Yeah.
and you're 17 years old, but you're going to be 18 before the general election. The primary may come up before you turn 18. So the idea is to allow those 17-year-olds who will be 18 before the general election to also participate in the primary. And again, I think the idea underneath it is, if I'm going to be voting in November, I want to be involved and understand the issues when the primary comes up, because I'm going to be voting then. So why not let me vote in the primary in order to get ensconced?
Yeah, you got it, Jessica.
Yeah, so this is one where Democrats have tried, I think, 6 or 7 times to get this on the ballot, and they were successful this time. And it's, as you said, it's not going to affect that many people. It's about saying to 17-year-olds, really start taking part in the process. So if you're going to vote in the general election, you can get a say in who the candidates are in the general election. If there's a special or a primary when you're 17, but you're, as you said, you're going to be 18 by the time there's the general election, then you can vote. And this is frankly part of a theme that California has been at the forefront of, I would say, which is making it easier to vote and trying to bring more people into the habit of voting. So think about same-day voter registration. Think about registering at the DMV. I think there are 23 states that currently allow 17-year-olds to vote in some circumstances. So we wouldn't be an outlier in this case. What we know from social science studies, political science studies, is that once people start to vote, and particularly when they start to vote young, it can be a habit. And one of the things to think about is how underrepresented young people are in terms of being a voting bloc. You really don't vote in anywhere near your numbers until you age into essentially parenthood or almost grandparenthood. And so this is about trying to change that trend and get people into civic engagement earlier.
Yeah. And, it again, it's very symbolic because from a practical perspective, you're really not talking about a lot of people. And we say 17-year-olds, we're really talking about 17-and-a-half-year-olds, actually 17. If we have the primaries in June, sometimes it's really 17-and-3/4-year-olds. Remember, it's only if you turn 18 in between the primary and the general election. Very supportive. It continues a trend, as Jessica said, of continuing inclusion and getting rid of obstacles and barriers to participation in California.
Right, and the opponents say, I've got a 17-year-old who I wouldn't trust to take the family car around the block. So
and I know a lot of 50-year-olds that I wouldn't even trust with all kinds of different things. Yet we let them vote. So,
exactly.
Yeah.
So those are the arguments. And so if you vote in favor of this proposition, you're saying, yes, let's let someone who's going to turn 18 prior to the general election participate in the primary. So let's move forward to Prop 19, which I've labeled hardest to understand if you're not a property owner, and perhaps even if you are. Prop 19 is the property tax transfers, exemptions, and revenue for wildfire agencies and counties.
Because it's so hard to understand, we're going to have Jessica start.
Yeah.
All right, I made some notes on this. So this is, again, we're seeing Proposition 13 kind of looms large on our election. And so Prop 19 is in a way related to Prop 13, and it's allowing these property tax breaks, again, freezing the property taxes and this is just for residential owners for certain people. So if you are a senior, which I'm looking at the age, and a lot of people over 55 would not consider themselves seniors, but that's under the ballot, they would. I know as I near closer and closer to that age, I think there's no way that's a senior. Right. So if you're over 55, if you're disabled.
Hey, but I'll still take my Denny's Grand Slam discount, but not, still don't want to be labeled as a senior.
There's no shame in taking that discount. if you're disabled or if you're a victim of a natural disaster, then you can sell your home and move and still take some of that tax base, that favorable tax base with you, I believe up to $1 million. It also means that if you inherit property, so this is for the kids and the grandkids, and you can't keep the whole old tax basis, you can't keep the full favorable tax basis, you would be able to keep up to $1 million. Now, there was a lot of wrangling about, what's going to happen. This was put on by the legislature by Kevin Mullen, a Democrat from the Bay Area. And at the end, they decided, well, where would the additional money go that's generated? And it's going to go to disaster relief, which is obviously something now that we've just lived through another series of fires, or we are at this moment. It's something that I think everyone knew was going to be on the forefront of our consciousness. And so you're right. I mean, I hope I explained it a bit. This one is, to me, the trickiest. And again, it's about whether you want homeowners to be able to keep part of their tax basis when they move. They tried an iteration of this, I believe, last cycle or the cycle before. And realtors are really in favor of this because they want people to move and not to have to stay in their houses, because they say, well, I would move, but I can't afford to. I don't want the new taxes. And so realtors want people obviously to engage in transactions, and that's part of the reason why they're in favor of it.
Sure, and I'll insert an opinion before Dr. Guerra does.
Yeah,
I
please.
get a lot of the people who are 55 plus, when they're moving, they're not moving to upgrade lifestyle. They're usually moving to downsize and find something more affordable. So it's an interesting idea to say, let's give them a little break on the taxes. When you inherit something, you may have nothing to your name, so to lose a lot in taxes makes a lot of sense. I think the tricky part is that they sort of sneak in the wildfire agencies and all that to make it look more noble.
Yeah. Now, I just want to follow up on what Jessica said. This is really a play by the realtors to try to churn and get more people to sell their homes by sweetening the pot. Already, those who are going to sweeten the pot have been taking advantage of Proposition 13 for 43 years and great tremendous advantage. We have the lowest homeowner rate in California. And in part, it's this whole system of Proposition 13 and obviously high value properties. But I'm totally against this because it is the way legislation is made. It's a distortion of this of the initiative system in California, and it's really a special interest, realtors who want to make more money, and that's why they're tinkering with the Constitution.
Great, thank you. I'm going to accelerate because we got a lot of propositions to go and not a lot of time. I've labeled Prop 20. I labeled it most important for people of color, and maybe you can refute or support that. It's the Criminal Sentencing, Parole, and DNA Collection Initiative, which makes changes to policies related to criminal sentencing charges, prison release, and DNA collection. Help us out.
All right, so this is about, I'm sorry, can you hear the background noise?
No.
You're good.
Okay, they're jackhammering across the street.
We don't hear it at all.
All right.
It's just in my head. So Prop 20 is really about trying to roll back some of Jerry Brown's more kind of anti-tough on crime measures. So in California, we had an era where we were very tough on crime. Think about 3 strikes. And then Jerry Brown came in and he really supported or was at the forefront of a number of measures where it would reduce how quote unquote tough on crime we are. So it would give, we reorganized some offenses and we said, these really aren't a felony. These are really misdemeanors and you should be punished a bit less. We gave judges some more discretion in terms of sentencing. And so what this would do is actually roll back the leniency. And so who's in favor of it? It's largely law enforcement. So let's give a couple of specifics here. Prosecutors could be able to charge now as a felony instead of a misdemeanor certain things like repeat or organized petty theft. It would also say to probation officers that you can seek tougher penalties for people who have violated parole, I think at least 3 times. And it would exclude people who've been convicted of domestic violence or other non-violent crimes from being eligible for early parole. So this is really about swinging the pendulum back a little bit to being slightly, quote unquote, tougher on crime. And again, who supports it? It's largely the law enforcement community.
Many of these ideas sound good, but there's very little data to support any of these arguments. And in fact, most of the data we do have show that criminal justice reform is beginning to work, that crime was declining and declining drastically. Maybe it's a little bit of an uptick right now because of COVID for a variety of different reasons, but it doesn't, there's no indication that Jerry Brown's reform or criminal justice reform was leading to greater crime. In fact, it was the reverse. Tough to make the link, but they have this proposition, and the proponents of this proposition have a much tougher time trying to convince me in terms of with data that they are correct. There's no indication that they have the data to prove their basically their allegations in terms of this proposition. I am definitely voting no on this one.
Yeah.
One thing, oh, sorry, just one thing for people to consider when they're thinking about being tough on crime, and this isn't actually an endorsement or a, you know, I'm not actually supporting or endorsing it, but to say that if you recategorize certain crimes as felonies, it means that we will pay for people to be in jail, and jails will be overcrowded. And so it does cost money. So part of what you need to think about is, do you think criminal justice reforms are working? As Dr. Guerra said, you know, where are the statistics? And part of what you need to think about is where you want our money to go. And again, we have terrible overcrowding in the prisons. I'm not saying vote for or against it, but I'm saying that whenever we have these tough on crime measures, we do have to think about how to fund it.
And I'm going to say, you know, as a Black man in Los Angeles, I already know that I'm 3 to 5 times more likely to get a stiffer, tougher sentence for having a taillight out. That's my experience. So I'm not really a fan of anything that allows people to be even tougher on especially people of color. So that's proposition 20. Let's go to 21, which I said is most interesting based upon who in the news is for and against it. This is the housing proposition that expands local government's power to use rent control. I have a feeling that a lot of this is financially based sort of argument. But a yes vote supports this initiative to allow governments to enact rent control on housing that was first occupied over 15 years ago, with an exception for landlords who own no more than 2 homes. So it's a lot of stuff.
So yeah,
but it's rent control, basically, the ability to do more rent control in your cities. What do we think?
So this was put on by the ballot by the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and the former leader of the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, Michael Weinstein, actually was at the forefront of bringing a very similar measure to the ballot. I think it was just 2 years ago,
yeah.
And it was pretty resoundingly defeated. But this is his cause célèbre. He feels that many of the problems and inequalities in Los Angeles and in California are really caused by the lack of rent control. And so he's brought this back again. This would be a statewide rent control measure. Generally, I think Californians are in favor of rent control, but they're a little bit confused about the devil in the details and what exactly this would mean. But again, the takeaway is it would allow cities to introduce new rent control laws or expand new ones. It doesn't mandate rent control. It gives cities the flexibility of permitting rent control.
Yeah. You have progressives and conservatives on both sides of this argument. So it's not a Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. I think the governor has actually endorsed the no side on this.
Yes.
So what's happening here is it doesn't, you're not voting to actually institute rent control. You're voting to allow local cities to debate it. and have it on their own, so that you may have rent control in Beverly Hills or Santa Monica, but not in West Hollywood or Los Angeles or Glendale, let's say. And so this allows for a local choice. And that's why to some extent, I'm in favor of it. Let the city councils that know their communities decide whether to instill it or not. And so it's that to me is the main argument that appeals to me. It's not a one size fits all across the state of California.
That's great. And just so you know, Governor Newsom opposes this proposition.
Yes. Yep.
Bernie Sanders is a proponent of it.
Correct. Absolutely. So 2 Democrats. Yeah.
Add that in. Okay. This one I labeled based on the biggest gap between workers and owners. This is Prop 22, which is the app-based drivers as contractors and labor policies initiative. Basically talking about Uber drivers and Lyft drivers and people like that, whether they should be classified as independent contractors or whether they should be classified as employees, which would entitle them to certain insurance and things like that.
Right.
So fill us in.
So this one is, again, that when I listen to both the proponents and opponents, I agree with both of them and their arguments. I think they're both right in terms of the potential impacts. It's basically this whole independent contractor issue has always been squirted around, because you clearly know whether you're an employer or not, but so many employers use the independent contractors to get away from providing benefits, providing full time, and treating their workers equitably.
Yeah.
I don't believe that the apps and the Ubers and DoorDash and Lyft started that way. It's just a new technology, but it really will impact the ability of these apps to do their service. And I do believe that they will actually, some of them will actually quit the state of California, and the state has to accommodate new technologies while at the same time making sure that workers are not taken advantage of. I don't think this proposition necessarily does it. I think the legislature is not doing its job. As a matter of fact, let me make a general point about all of these. Most of these, the state legislature could have taken care of it, right? But because of interest fighting, they could make a decision, so they bring it to the voters. And that's what you're seeing here. And it's a tough one. I still really haven't decided how to vote on this one myself, but leaning right now to yes, but tomorrow I could be saying no. Jessica?
Yeah, so this deals with, I think, one of the most well-known pieces of legislation from not the last legislative session, but 2 legislative sessions ago, that was authored by Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez, AB 5. And what AB 5 did, as Dr. Guerra says, it recategorized certain workers as employees. So specifically Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, Postmates, Instacart. It said to these employees, or excuse me, it said to these workers, you can now have the protection of being an employee. You get sick leave, you get healthcare, you get minimum wage. And so you get the protections of being an employee. Uber, Lyft, Instacart, DoorDash, Postmates, again, immediately said, we're very much against this. And they started, in this case, a very expensive ballot measure. And so this would essentially repeal AB 5. And it would mean that the people who work for all those gig economy employers could again be independent contractors. It provides some floor of support for them, but that's really, I think, kind of a sweetener so that people aren't exactly sure what might be better for the workers. It shows how much we're going to be talking about the gig economy and protections for workers. One of the least popular parts of AB 5 for a lot of Californians was that it included a lot of freelancers. And that problem was actually just closed by the legislature. So famously, Willie Brown, the former Speaker of the Assembly and Mayor of San Francisco, just wrote a column and he said, this is my last column in the San Francisco Chronicle because of AB 5. because I'm a freelancer for the San Francisco Chronicle, I had to be recategorized as an employee. They won't do that. And so I can't keep publishing and being paid. And so Gavin Newsom, I think just a few weeks ago, signed a bill that would allow people like Willie Brown to continue as freelancers.
Right.
And there's a text that Willie Brown showed a journalist that said, I signed the law, write the damn column.
Right. Okay. So folks at home, do some research on this, because we're all a little,
and this, you're going to get a lot of commercials. There is going to be over $150 million spent by both sides together trying to convince you one way or the other.
All right. We're running out of time, so I'm going to try to fly through the next ones. This one I call the one I feel least qualified to vote on. It's the dialysis clinic requirements, and I know nothing about dialysis clinics except my dear friend who does dialysis all the time. A yes vote on this supports requiring chronic dialysis clinics to A, have a physician on site while patients are being treated, B, report data on dialysis-related infections, and C, obtain consent from the state health department before they can close a clinic, and D, not discriminate against clinics based on the source of their payment.
So yeah, this is another one where you have two interest groups fighting each other. They went to the legislature, couldn't get resolved, so one of them put it on the ballot. This is the second time we're seeing this. From my perspective, it has nothing to do with the patients, the dialysis patients. It has nothing to do with the general California community. It's really the unions fighting the owners of these dialysis centers. These dialysis centers are very large conglomerates that make billions of dollars. The unions are saying they're not treating their workers right. They should unionize. They refuse to do so. So the unions have put this to some extent to punish them. Having a physician on site for dialysis treatment, it doesn't tell you what kind of physician. You can get a retired one. You can have one that knows even less than the physician assistants that are there. And so it's really not about the patients. It's using the patients for this union corporation fight that they're having. Jessica?
Yeah, I have very little to add to that. It's about, this is not really about, do you want more restrictions on dialysis clinics? It's about the SEIU that's been at war with the two big dialysis clinics and the SEIU, obviously the workers, as Dr. Guerra said, have tried to unionize. These two big for-profit dialysis clinics that dominate the state have said no. And this is essentially how they're duking out that battle, is through this ballot measure.
Yeah, so all I'll say is I tried to do research to this. I called my friend who does dialysis, and he said, it has nothing to do with me. So
yeah, right.
So do your research on that. Let's go on to Prop 24. We're getting there. This is the one I called the biggest impact upon future technology. Let's see if it is. It's the Consumer Personal Information Law and Agency Initiative, which expands the provisions of the California Consumer Privacy Act and creates, it creates a bunch of stuff that I'll let these guys explain.
Jessica?
Okay, so California actually has the strictest in the country by far consumer privacy protection law. It was passed in 2018 by the legislature, not by initiative. And it gives consumers a lot of different rights, like find out what kind of data companies are using about you, or you have the right to opt out, or you have the right to try and scrub your data from certain websites. As you said, this issue of consumer privacy, it's going to be something that we have to deal with more and more and more. Why? Because technology is changing and there's more ways to find out about our behavior. There's a wealthy real estate developer named Alistair MacTaggart. I had to look at my notes. And he wanted an even stricter law back in 2018. He's now coming to us, the voters. This was put on the ballot by the initiative process, and he's saying we need a stricter law. What does the stricter law mean? It basically means an enforcement agency if you violate the existing laws. It also means stricter penalties. There's some reticence for this because we haven't really seen how the 2018 law, again, the strictest in the nation, has played out. So I know that there are some groups that might typically be in favor of the law, typically in favor of, you see consumer protection and you would think this is a group that's in favor of consumer protection. But they're saying, can we see what happens? Again, worrying about whether or not some businesses might say, is it just becoming untenable to do business in California? You already had the strictest protections for consumer privacy. So that's what we're seeing in this ballot initiative.
Yeah. So there's a lot to unpack there. There's a lot of different aspects that I don't understand or have issues with, but overall, I'm probably going to be supportive of it because symbolically it helps the consumer and it protects the individual privacy more than any other piece of legislation in the nation. And we've seen some movement backwards at the federal level. So it's going to take someone like California to really push for privacy protection. And that's what this does. It is the most consumer-friendly privacy protection law in the land.
I hate it when I go to a store and go to pay for something and the first thing they ask is for my email. And I always say, does this mean I'm going to get 1,000 emails from you? And they say, oh, no, we don't do that.
Right. And then they sell it, et cetera.
Yeah, all kinds of things. So that's Prop 24. And here's the final one of our discussion today, which is Prop 25. I voted it most likely to have a hidden agenda. And I don't know if you'll agree with me or not, but it felt like it when I studied it. This is the replace cash bail with risk assessment referendum. Basically means that instead of if you're arrested, now you can pay cash and get out on bail, or you can go to a bail bondsman who pays cash. But now they're trying to replace that cash idea with some kind of risk assessment that I personally don't understand, and hopefully you two do.
Well, given that it's complicated, we're going to start with Jessica.
So in 2018, the California legislature acted, and they acted on the advice of the Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court. And what they did is they essentially repealed cash bail. They repealed money bail. And they instead are in favor of a system where judges look at, well, how dangerous is it to put you, back on the street while your case is being heard? What is the risk to the community? Are we sure that you're going to come back? The bail bonds companies obviously are in fear of being put out of business. So they've put this on the ballot to say, no, we really think it's a great idea if you think about money bail. And so voters can think about this kind of as a corollary to Prop 22, the gig economy, where there was a legislative measure and it would have harmed certain business interests. Again, that legislative measure, AB 5, dealing with categorizing workers as employees for Uber, Lyft, Postmates, Instacart. In this case, a legislative measure which would kind of put bail bonds people out of business. The bail bonds people say, not so fast. I'm using the initiative process and I'm going to, try and make my case directly to the California voters.
Yeah, all you need to know is that the bail bond business is the one that.
Uh-oh, that's a short tweet. There you go. You froze for a second. You're back now.
Okay. I was just saying, all you need to know is that the bail bonds business are the ones that put it in, and number two are going to fund it. And so that should tell you who's going to make out on this. It's not going to be the typical person. It's going to be,
So I'm sorry. I think I actually explained it the wrong way. Voting yes will keep the state law and end cash bail. Voting no will keep cash bail.
Right. So let me ask you this, Professor. If they opt to more of a risk assessment model, which apparently is already somewhat in place, does implicit bias play into that? Because now you have to look at me and decide what kind of risk I am. Doesn't that work against people of color and people of low income, et cetera?
Well, I think people who are low income actually have the most trouble getting the money together also for the bail bonds. So I'm not sure that it goes that cleanly that way. I mean, it's kind of a blunt force way of ensuring that people aren't allowed out unless we're sure that they will come back into the court system.
Right.
And so I will say just my personal experience from judges is that I have a lot of faith in judges actually trying to do their best to make these assessments. And it's, in a way, it's not clear that a bail bond system is the best way to try and get at your goal. And it does disproportionately impact people from lower income situations.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
this doesn't get rid of implicit bias, but certainly the current system has tremendous amount of implicit bias, or the old bail bond system has. It basically says if you have money, you can get out, and you shouldn't be able to get out just because you have money. It should be a risk assessment. What's the likelihood that you're going to do harm while you're out? What's the likelihood that you're going to come back? End of story. Now, how much money you have or access to money.
Great. Well, you both did an amazing job of making these propositions accessible and understandable. And I'm hoping that everybody watching sees the tremendous responsibility we have to at least have some understanding of what a yes vote means and what a no vote means, and also some understanding of how it's going to impact our community and our state, and therefore eventually our nation. Any closing comments?
Yeah, I do have a closing comment. It is incredibly important that we vote early. Most of us know how we're going to vote for president, Congress, etc. What's going to make us procrastinate are these initiatives. And in part, this is why Jessica and I are doing this. We're doing this in our class. I have 2 other sessions like this that I'm going to do. I'm trying to convince people to study these. Don't use these 12 propositions as an excuse to procrastinate. We need you to vote early, given the situation that is existing. That's my number one point of view for you out there. Also, hold on to your expectations of knowing the results on election day. You know, it's not that important for democracy that we know exactly who won or what proposition won on election night. So what if it takes another day, 2, 3, or even a week? It doesn't matter as long as we get democracy right and we get the answer right. It's not about immediate gratification, and that's what it's become. And so temper that. But you can help us and help the system do it faster by voting early. And you can vote earlier by understanding these propositions.
Excellent. Professor Levinson, closing comment?
Oh, no, that's exactly right. I mean, Dr. Guerra nailed it. There's no reason to wait. We hope you look at the ballot measures, put those ballots either in a safe drop box or back in the mail, or bring it to a polling place if you feel comfortable doing that. And in fact, it likely means that something is going very right if we don't know all the results on election day, because it means we are carefully counting, right, and we have a lot more vote by mail. We don't want this fast, we want it right. And it may be that people need to be prepared for some results to actually shift over time. That doesn't mean there's anything nefarious or fraudulent. It actually means that county registrars, state election administrators are doing their job carefully.
Right. So folks at home, it may be a little harder this year to vote. You may have to make a little more effort. You may have to do a few more things, but it's never been a more important time to vote. And everyone should have a voice. Whatever your political stance, whatever your views, whatever your income, whatever your ethnic background, you should all exercise your right to be a part of this system. I'm so grateful to have 2 such amazing experts give us insight into all of these propositions. I hope it helps all of you at home make the right decisions, and it also motivates you to cast that vote. And as they said, cast it early, cast it as soon as you can so that it doesn't muck up the works of what's going on. Professor Levinson, Dr. Guerra, thank you so much.
Thank you. Great job, Stuart.
We appreciate you. Thank you. We'll see you soon. We'll see you at the polls.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks again.